I I felt invited to walk into the book of Acts, and I was really just kind of overwhelmed because I was taken from the library in heaven to the upper room in Israel with 120 people waiting for the outpouring of the Holy Spirit. And
So you were seeing like history.
I was actually watching history,
Mm.
and it was like I stepped into the book, I stepped into that chapter in the book of Acts. And I've been to Israel, and I've been to what they say is the upper room, or what the upper room might have looked like back then. And it was actually, what's interesting is I know the book of Acts says that, oh, my hair's all crazy. I know the book of Acts says that it was like 9 a.m. when they ended up like toppling out of the room, and everybody thought that they were drunk, but it was actually the first watch. It was like really early in the morning when that outpouring happened, and that meant that all of the people that were there in the upper room, they must have stayed up all night long. Like, they were taking watches, prayer vigils, to wait for this promise of the Father, and nobody wanted to miss it. And I saw just how sad and like how afraid and how desperate a lot of these people were in the upper room that ended up receiving the baptism of the Holy Spirit and fire. And, you look around and you see like Peter, who had betrayed Jesus 3 times, and the other ones who completely deserted him. And what was crazy is I had this understanding that the ones that were there in the upper room, like there were 500 that watched Jesus ascend, right? And he said, go into Jerusalem, go and wait for the promise of the Father. Like, don't leave until you get this power from on high. There were 500 that heard him say that, yet there was only 120 that actually listened and obeyed, that waited it out. And the Lord showed me that it was the 120 that were really dead. Like, they had nothing else to live for. Like, their Messiah had been crucified, he was gone. You know, People were coming to find and murder the believers, the followers of Jesus. Like, they really had nothing to live for. They were really dead to themselves. And so they were willing to wait, because that was all that they had to look forward to.
Mm-hmm.
And then I literally felt it felt like a sonic blast go off in the room, and this gushing wind, like a tornado, entered, and I saw fire that it wasn't red flames. It actually almost looked like prismatic color,
Wow.
and bright, like blue fire come down, and it separated into 120 different flames and then rested on each person's head in the upper room. And they all looked like, I'm looking at all of them, and they looked like they were candles on a cake. It was the craziest thing. And then they all start like busting out in all sorts of different languages, and then there was crying, and there was weeping, and then there was spontaneous deliverance. I mean, it was like a bomb went off in the room.
Mm.
And then after hours of that, then the drunken glory came on them,
Mm-hmm.
and they started experiencing the euphoria of what it felt like to be one with God in spirit again, back to where, sin had not entered, just like Adam and Eve experienced before the fall, that union with God. And that is life. And these people that went from being cowards, 1 minute, were all of a sudden filled with so much courage that they didn't care if they got killed. They didn't care if they were martyred. They came out of hiding and, Peter stood up and he preached that infamous message where 3,000 people gave their lives to Jesus. And how wild it was. And it's interesting to me that it wasn't like judgment or like, the fear of the Lord necessarily that the upper room church was manifesting in that moment. It was literally the pleasures of God,
Mm.
because they're like, you're drunk, because they were acting drunk and inebriated. And he's like, no, this is the promise, like, that was prophesied. And they're not even talking about the Psalms that talk about experiencing pleasure in God's presence. There's euphoria at his right hand forevermore in Psalm 16.
Mhm.
They're not even he didn't talk about that. They didn't quote David. They quoted Joel too, about the promise of the outpouring. So
Mm.
there's something to that too. There's something about being so full of God's Spirit, so intoxicated by his love and by his goodness, that it becomes a sign and a wonder in a dark world.
Mm.
Everything that Jesus had, and like, you have to understand, I'm like getting supernatural download. Like, nobody's speaking to me, but the Spirit is revealing information to me, kind of like you would get a word of knowledge, I guess. Realize that the gospel became extremely real to them in this instant, meaning that all the teachings that Jesus had given them while he was on earth, specifically talking about his Father and about the kingdom and about family, about, who are my brother and sister? It's those who do the will of my Father in heaven. Like, they got this revelation because, see, the Holy Spirit is the spirit of adoption, and they would know that kingdoms were literally royal families, and that the lineage, it was about a royal lineage that was passed down to sons and daughters. And so they received the spirit of adoption back into royal lineage when they received the Holy Spirit. And they understood that in order to receive their entire inheritance as co-heirs in Christ, they had to accept the sufferings of Christ as their own. So, in other words, they knew that they had to themselves, just as Christ had done for them. Jesus gave his life for his bride and his all on the cross. He poured out his all, and he gave his best by sending the Holy Spirit. And so the only proper response for them, and really for us to do that same thing, is to give our all and our best back to him. I asked Jesus one time, Jesus, he was teaching me about the power of the blood, and he showed me that one drop of his blood could have completely done the job that needed to be done, as far as, canceling out our sin and, cleansing the earth and, redeeming everything. One drop of his blood. And so I said, Jesus, why, if it only took one drop, why did you go through everything that you went through?
Mm.
Why did you pour it all out? And he said, because, Christa, if I had only given one drop of my blood for you, then it would only be required a small portion of you to be given to me in return. He said, but I wanted all of you. And so I gave my all so that you would be compelled to give your all.
Mm. Yeah.
And
Awesome.
that brought me.